All right. We're excited to have you here. I want to welcome you to Flatiron School's Tech in 20, Why Every Programmer Should Learn Python. My name's Catherine Sommerfeld. I'm the Director of Marketing Campaigns and Events here at Flatiron School. Part of my team's job is hosting free introductory workshops like today's to give you the opportunity to meet some of our instructors and get a better feel of the Flatiron School experience. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our host for this afternoon, Alvi Akand. He is one of our senior curriculum managers. Take it away, Alvi.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Welcome, everyone. It seems there are a lot of people here and a lot of career changers. So this is going to be interesting. So as Catherine said, I'm Alvi. I'm one of the curriculum managers at Flatiron School. What that means is basically I manage our consumer enterprise programs and sometimes develop curriculum as well. Outside of work, I also host coding meetups in New York, primarily data structures and algorithms. But I also host meetups on testing, backend development, and things like that. So we're going to be talking about Python today. And my goal here is twofold. First, I'll try to give you a sense of why Python is important or why people love using Python. And then secondly, I'll try to give you a brief guide on how to get started with Python and how not to get distracted when you're trying to learn things on your own. Because I learned most of programming on my own because my background is in electrical engineering, but I learned programming on my own. So when you're learning on your own, it can be overwhelming to see so many resources online. So I'll try to hopefully guide you in like how to learn on your own in a more methodical manner, right? So let me start by sharing my screen and then we'll get started. Right. I'll also make sure to open up the chat. And if you have any questions at all, please post them in the chat. I'll try to answer all of them by the end of the session. And I might ask for clarifications or pause for questions during the presentation. But since we are a bit short on time, I'll probably go through the presentation and then take questions one by one. All right, so before I get into Python, right, just a quick on programming languages. So if you haven't programmed before and you were researching on what programming language to learn, you may have seen that there's a ton of possibilities, right? So this is the list for programming languages on Wikipedia. This, this is quite the list, right? So the thing about learning programming languages is a lot of the concepts transfer across languages, right? So in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter which specific languages you know. It's more about whether or not you can understand the fundamental concepts and can reason about the code that you write, right? So just wanted to set the context for that. Having said that, I do think some languages are better suited for beginners, such as Ruby, Python, maybe JavaScript for certain types of beginners. So what makes Python better for beginners than all the other languages that are available, right? So let's talk about the essence of Python, right? What makes it so good? And the thing about Python is it is really, really simple to read and understand. It almost reads like the English language, right? So the best way to demonstrate this is to show you two examples, right? So one example will be from the Java programming language, which is also a very popular programming language. And then I'll show you what the same program looks like in Python, right? So look at this. So the image here shows the code that requires you, or the code that's needed to display the words hello and world on a computer console or display, right? You have to do all of this just to show the words hello world, right? So this is the code that you have. These things here, you need to do all of this in order to run the actual code that you run, because you write the code in English, but the computer doesn't understand English, right? You have to instruct the computer on how to understand your code and convert it into something that it can understand. And in order to do that, you have to do this, and then you have to do this with Java. Whereas for the Python one, this is the code itself, and this is the command you have to give the computer so that it can take the code and then convert it to something that it can understand and execute, right? So as we can see, the difference in complexity is quite big, right? And when you're starting out, the nuances around all of this can be distracting, right? So what Python allows you to do is to focus on the core concepts. The core concept in this case is being able to display text on a computer screen, right? And Python allows you to do that with just the print function. Whereas if you were to use a more complicated language like Java, you'd have to do all this setup and then run all these commands in order to actually see what's happening, right? So this is why languages like Python and Ruby makes it easier to get started and like drive your focus towards concepts, universal concepts that you can understand, learn, and then apply across programming languages. So if you start with Python, you'll still understand all the core fundamentals of programming, which then you can apply to learn other languages as required. Because even though Java seems complicated, it has its advantages, right? So we won't get into that, but if you can understand Python code, you should be able to pick up other languages pretty easily, right? And this is just an example of what running the code actually does. So you can think of the console as a place where the computer outputs text, right? And you can see the complex commands that I showed you is being run here, right? Similarly, this is the Python code, where if I click on run, it simply displays the output. I think this really helps beginners because it takes away the unnecessary complexity and lets you focus on the core ideas at hand, right? So simplicity is one of the defining features of Python, right? But there are other languages that are relatively simple to understand, right? So what makes it Python better than even those languages, right? This is where the second thing about Python comes in. It's versatility. What this means is Python can be used across a lot of different applications, right? So its simplicity makes it very popular among developers, which means they are more likely to develop tools for their specific use cases and then make those tools available for everyone else. So what are some of the applications that you can use Python for? So you can write scripts for Python. Scripts are basically certain instructors that allow you to automate tasks, all right? So you can use it for automation. You can use it for data analysis, right? You can use it for machine learning. You can use it to build web applications. You can use it to build games as well, right? So you can do all of this with Python. And I learned Python. So Python was the second language I learned. And I have used it in lots of different contexts over my career. So I've had to use it for crunching data for some experiments or research. I've had to use it for building like web APIs. I've had to use it to build small games because it was fun. And then I also used Python as one of the primary languages for data structures and algorithms, right? So that versatility makes it really great for beginners because it allows you to branch out as you learn more Python. So you can start by learning the fundamental core concepts that you need to know as a programmer, and then you can branch out into different areas using the same language. So you don't have to spend a lot of time learning other languages in order to do something that you're really interested in. So for example, if you are interested in doing data analysis, knowing different languages, how they work, their benefits, pros, cons, won't really help you do the main task at hand, which is gathering data and then analyzing it, right? So if you know a language that can be used across different contexts, it makes it easy for you to focus on your main interests rather than getting bogged down with complexity, right? And then the third thing is popularity. So let's look at the survey here. So Stack Overflow is one of the most visited website by developers. It's basically a Q&A forum for programmers, right? So it's one of the most popular websites among developers that you'll see. So here's the programming, scripting, and markup languages, right? So professional developers, okay? You can see JS or JavaScript, HTML, CSS, SQL, and Python at the top, right? So JavaScript is on top because browsers can only run JavaScript. So if you want to build applications for web browsers, you have to learn some JavaScript no matter what, right? Technically, you can like use other languages and then convert them into JavaScript, and you still have to understand it, which is why it's disproportionately more popular than other languages, right? HTML, CSS, these HTML, CSS, and SQL, these serve completely different purposes from JavaScript and Python, right? So HTML and CSS, HTML would be a markup language, CSS would be a styling language, and SQL is a database language. Right? So these are specific languages developed for very specific tasks, whereas Python, it's a general programming language, which means you can use it across different applications or different contexts, right? So that's one part of the popularity. The second part about popularity of technologies or languages is whether or not it continues to be popular, right? So this index here shows you how the popularity of a language changed over the years, right? And you can see that Python is at the top here, okay? You can see these other languages in here as well, C, C++, JS, SQL, all that. So this shows that not only is Python popular, it continues to be popular. And the reason for that is Python is continuously evolving and adapting to the needs of developers who use it. The fact that it evolves and adapts pretty quickly with regard to their users makes it increasingly popular, right? Which means if you start learning it now, it's going to take you some time to learn, right? And it's still going to be relevant by the time you finish learning and start applying it, right? So like the two parts of popularity are both in favor of Python, okay? And then one other thing of being popular is it leads to a large community, all right? I've provided a couple of links in there if you are curious, but the Python community is one of the most supportive, accommodating, and friendly communities. So if you're learning or trying to get into programming, they could really help you understand certain concepts or at least guide you towards the resources that you may need, right? Which brings me to my last point is that excellent resources, right? So Python is popular and Python is taught across different industries and it's taught in pretty much every computer science program, right? What this means is there are tons of amazing books, tutorials, videos, resources on learning Python, okay? And the reason I bring it up is, as I mentioned before, I learned most of programming on my own, and I had to learn data structures and algorithms as well, right? So some languages aren't very good for specific applications. Like JavaScript, it's not very good for data structures and algorithms because it doesn't provide you with a lot of tools, right? Whereas Python does provide you with a bunch of built-in data structures and convenient functions or methods, right? So what this means is there are several specific books that are written using Python, right? So if you're learning a more abstract concept, you can see concrete applications of that or concrete examples of that with Python because it's really popular and because it's also taught in an academic setting, right? So with that said, since we are a bit short on time, I will briefly talk about a few resources just to get you started. And I'll answer your questions afterwards. So just to reiterate, when you're starting out, it's really easy to get overwhelmed by all the different resources that are available. Especially these days, there are like hundreds of tutorial websites or like interactive websites and all that fancy stuff, right? So what I would recommend is to understand the fundamentals of programming, just start with this book. And then the part one covers the core concepts or the core programming concepts and the very basics of Python. That should be enough to get you started learning and using Python, okay? And then part two gives you the opportunity to work on small projects that will help you reinforce the things that you learn in part one, right? So focus on getting through this book at least up to chapter 16, and then you can worry about what exactly you want to learn or what sort of software engineer you want to become. So like if you want to focus on data science, do you want to focus on full stack development? Do you want to focus on more scientific scientific applications? You can do that as well, right? So you should start here, finish up to chapter 16, and then figure out what exactly you want to do. The second book, these are some small exercises to reinforce the concepts that you learn in the first book, right? And this should be free. The second book is free. So if you don't understand a concept from the first book, try to find an exercise in here that uses that concept, and hopefully that will help you understand it better. And then there are some additional books. All of these are free. This is for like Al Swigert. He writes great Python books. So this can help you fill in some gaps from the first book, if there are any, right? I'm not gonna talk about other resources. It's not really important for beginners. You should focus on learning the language fundamentals or the core programming concepts before worrying about other complex things like full stack development or how to gather and analyze complex data sets, right? So with that said, since we're a bit short on time, I will go into the Q&A session, right? So you can ask the questions in the chat, but I'll go through some to see if there are already questions in there. Okay, let's see if there are any questions.
I haven't seen anything that I haven't been able to answer so far. I've dropped a few links in the chat, including information on our tuition and financing.
Okay.
I've also dropped the link to our free introductory lesson. Other than that, I think we've covered all of the current questions. If anybody has specific questions for Alvi, he's a really great resource and font of wisdom. So definitely throw them either in the chat or in the Q&A. It looks like we might have one in the Q&A. Let's see.
Okay, I see a couple of questions. All right, so the first question is, how is Python used in the financial industry, especially banks? That's a great question, and I can actually answer that because one of my friends, well, a few of my friends work in the finance sector. So like I said, Python is a general application or like general programming language, which means if you need to automate some task, you can do that, and you can do the automation across different applications. So for example, you have to generate reports a lot in the financial industry, right? It's one of the most heavily regulated industries in the world. So Python can allow you to do those kinds of report automation or generation, right? More software engineer related things would be designing data pipelines. So Python is one of the foremost languages used in data science and data analysis. So you can create, when I say pipeline, I mean you put data at one end and useful insights come out from the other end, right? And financial companies generate lots and lots of information. So you can use Python to understand what data you're generating and how you can apply that to improve the business or your software, right? And then finally, you can also use Python to work on more core core systems. So for example, you can use it for certain trading applications as well, right? So because Python is a general language and because it has so many different kinds of tools available, you can use it across a lot of systems in the financial industry or any industry for that matter. Okay. What was the other question? Can you provide any insight in regards to gaining employment in this field without a college degree? Yeah, so I have I've met a few people, well, not a few, quite a few people who had degrees in unrelated fields, switched to software engineering, and then people who have become software engineers with just a high school degree, right? So the thing about that is, if you don't have a degree to signal that you know these concepts, you have to give other signals to recruiters, right? Because the hardest part is getting the interview, right? When you don't have a degree. So the way you do that is first focus on learning the core principles so you understand the concepts and can explain the concepts properly. The second thing is building projects, because by building projects, you can demonstrate or signal to the recruiters that you know what you're doing, that you can build complex applications from conception to deployment, right? So conception meaning coming up with the idea and design, and then deployment meaning making it available for users to interact with, right? And then finally, the third thing is connect with other people in the industry. So that way you can better show your skills to people directly, right? And then they can refer you to hiring teams, and then you can go from there. I would recommend keeping an eye out for internships or apprenticeships. These are some of these are specifically designed for people who don't have a conventional software engineer's background, which means like a non-engineering degree, right? So hopefully that gives you some insights on how to find employment without a college degree. So Michael asked, so as an absolute beginner, where should we start? You should start with the book that I recommended, the first one. It is designed for beginners. It will provide you some structure or guidance on where to go from there, right? Let's see. Are Python apps able to compare with Java and JavaScript apps in terms of reliability and speed? Ooh, that's an interesting question. So two parts. Is it as reliable as some other languages? The answer is yes. The reliability of a language depends more so on your development practices and how you're developing or designing your software rather than the language itself, because most modern languages are pretty stable and reliable, right? So the overall reliability of the application you build depends more on the design of the application or the architecture of the application. As for speed, the short answer is no. So Python is slower than Java. JavaScript is on a similar level as Python. Well, it depends on what tools you're using, but generally, Python is fast enough where large software engineering companies use it as well, right? So if you're a beginner, you won't have to worry about like speed ceilings for Python at all, right? You won't even have to worry about it when you're a mid-level engineer for most cases. If you work on an application that needs to be fast, like it has a special need to be really, really fast, or efficient for that matter, you can pick up other languages. But even then, sometimes Python is used on top of more performant languages. For example, trading platforms, right? So financial industries use lots of trading algorithms and trading platforms. The core of those platforms are usually designed with C++ or C, right? To make them more performant. But then you can create helper tools or helper libraries with Python and then interact with the lower level constructs that are created with the more complicated but faster languages, right? So to reiterate, it may be slower than some languages, but it is fast enough for pretty much every single use case that you're likely to encounter as a beginner. What IDE do you recommend? I recommend PyCharm. So PyCharm by JetBrains or VS Code. So PyCharm Community Edition is free, which should be more than enough for beginners and should be fine when you're up to the intermediate level. You may have to buy PyCharm once you're doing like really complex stuff, but to get started, PyCharm Community Edition is amazing. Oh, there's another follow-up from Ben. Interesting question. So would you say the greatest barrier by not having a degree is getting an interview? But if you are able to get an interview, the chances of getting hired is based primarily or solely on demonstrable knowledge and skills. So two parts. The first part is yes, the hardest part is getting an interview because most people are risk averse. And because they're so used to hiring people with a certain background, which means engineering degrees in comp-sci or adjacent fields like electrical engineering, they don't usually want to take risks, especially like smaller companies or mid-level companies. Really, smaller companies, they can take risk, but mid-level companies, they want to hire like very specific people sometimes. So yeah, getting interviews is the hardest part. And then technical or like interviews for technical roles are very, very, very skill dependent. You have to go through like 4 to 7 rounds sometimes to demonstrate that you have the skills that they're looking for, right? And then you have to walk them through the projects you developed so you can showcase your communication skills, technical skills, and collaboration skills. So getting the interview is the hardest part, assuming you actually have the skills or you have put in the time to learn learn programming languages or concepts, right? Because the interview may be really hard, but if you know the skill or if you have the skills, it's fine, right? Oh, this is a really important question from Christopher. Is it better to finish learning one programming language before expanding to others? Or could somebody learn JavaScript and Python at the same time? So short answer, yes, you should learn a programming language first, but you can't finish learning a programming language. programming languages are immensely complex, right? Like the fundamental concepts that I'm talking about carry across languages, but certain nuances don't carry over, right? Because the entire point of having so many programming languages is they allow you to do different things and they have different trade-offs. So what I would recommend is the book I recommended in the resources. If you finish the part 1, you'll know almost all the fundamental concepts you need to start learning other languages. And then you can see whether you like JS or not after that. So yes, focus on learning one programming language first, build a few projects, and then you can start thinking about moving on to either another programming language or another area of expertise, right? How much time do we have, Catherine?
We're over, but if you've got time, Alvi, I'm fine with
All right.
staying. I
All
think
right,
everybody's, we're
I
at
can answer a few more
1:36.
questions. All right,
Okay.
sounds good. One other thing I would note is, since we have a bit of a time, the simplicity of Python translates or carries over to the tools that you use with Python. What I mean by this is, I created this for my data structures workshops, but if you look at the code here, right, this also reads a lot like English. So plot something, and then I provide the parameters for plotting, and then I provide the label for plotting. So because the core of Python is so simple, the tools, libraries, and frameworks that's built on top of Python are also relatively simple to understand, right? So this is, again, one of the reasons why simplicity is good and why Python is so good for beginners, right? Just wanted to clarify that. All right, so let's see. What other questions do you have? What was the name of that book you recommended? It's Python Crash Course, 3rd edition, but I think Catherine's going to send out the slides too, so
Yep.
you should be able
Yeah,
to
they'll
find
be
them.
in the email that you get with the recording. And I also will drop the link to the presentation back in the chat one more time.
All right, so Scott asked, how important is having and contributing to a GitHub, and would Python alone be enough to get hired as a junior developer? So 2 parts to the question, how important is it to contribute to GitHub? Again, it depends. It is more important if you don't come from a traditional background. The reason is it adds to the signals you send to recruiters. So remember I said building good projects is a signal to recruiters that you are capable of doing the job. GitHub contributions show that you can use a standard industry tool and you are consistent in your practice, right? So like a 4-year degree basically tells the recruiter that you studied something for 4 years, like you were diligent enough to study properly and then graduate from a rigorous program. So if you can't show that, what you have to do is show them that you're consistent in your practice, and that practice is helping you to build these projects. So like all these different signals come together to amplify your capabilities to the recruiter. So yes, it is important to contribute to GitHub, especially if you don't come from a conventional background. But as you go further in your career, it becomes less important, because when you start working, you may not be able to commit publicly, or like commit means you won't be able to show your contributions on GitHub publicly. You might use private or company-based version control systems. So as you go further in your career, it becomes less important to have GitHub contributions. But when you're starting out, especially from a non-traditional background, it is important. All right. And then the second question is Python enough to get hired? So the programming language itself is not what gets you hired, because Python is the programming language, but you need to develop certain skills based on which area you're targeting. So for example, if you want to do full stack web development, or let's say just backend development, you need to understand the standard tools that are used with Python in order to develop those services. In the case of Python, that would be the Django framework or the Flask framework. Or if you are into data analysis, you would have to learn Python libraries like NumPy, Matplotlib, scikit, and so on. So learning the language is crucial. It's the first step, but then you have to decide which specific area you want to focus on and then tailor your projects to show your abilities or skills in that field, which is why like you'll see different specializations in 4-year degrees or even in boot camps. So for example, we have a full stack program, but we also have a data science program, right? So you learn Python in both, but the applications are very different from each other, right? So Helen asks, is Python a web dev language or language for data analysis? It's both. It's one of the most popular languages for data analysis, but is also very popular for developing websites, especially microservices you can develop with Python as well. It's pretty good. Let's see. Can you put the link to the Python ID from, okay. Yeah, I can do that. So it would be PyCharm community. Actually, I'll show you just because, yeah, I'll add it here for your reference. Python ID. PyCharm community edition. Right. So you want to go to this page and then download the community edition. If you download the professional edition, you won't be able to use it after 30 days. Right. Let's see. I think we're a bit over time, but Catherine, I don't have time to answer more questions.
Yep.
But thank you so much for all the wonderful questions that you asked, and hopefully the guidelines I've provided will allow you to learn a bit better. So thank you again for joining us, and hopefully you'll join us for some other sessions as well.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate that thank you again to everybody who zoomed in to join us today. If you have additional questions about Flatiron School, I'm going to go ahead and drop a link to schedule a brief chat with our admissions team. And as a reminder, you'll receive a copy of tonight's presentation within 3 business days after the event. If you want to see any of our other events or this one, which will also be there, you can check out our YouTube channel. Thanks again to everyone. Have a great day.